if you had a chance to read it. It was a great book. If you haven't, we have copies available in the back. I would like to say thank you to all the library staff who assisted us with planning, from the flyer to getting the word out and inviting different departments to participate with us. And at this time, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ellen Cole. Dr. Cole is an assistant professor in the Geography and Environmental Systems Department, a critical human geographer by training. Dr. Cole is interested in interplay between environmental policy and systematic oppression. To do this, she examines the interactions between community activists and governmental agencies to understand the strategies, activities that used to work within and against the state. Her recent work looks at the way science can be leveraged as a tool of operation, but also a tool of liberation. I would like to welcome Dr. Cole to the mic, and Dr. Cole will then introduce our panelists. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have 3 panelists with us here today. The first is Dr. Farah Nibs, who is an assistant professor in the Emergency and Disaster Health Systems Department at UMBC. Her research focuses on the intersection of disasters and critical infrastructure in small island states such as those of the Caribbean. She earned her doctorate in disaster science and management from the University of Delaware, Biden School of Public Policy and Administration under the mentorship of Professors Joseph Traynor and Sue McNeil. She's also worked as a graduate researcher in the Disaster Research Center at UD. Dr. Nibs holds a bachelor's degree from the People's Friendship University of Russia in political science, a master's degree from the University of Westminster, London in International Planning and Sustainable Development, and a master's degree in environmental engineering from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. She is currently working on research related to the growing issues of drought in the Caribbean and is exploring the potential impact this will have on critical water infrastructure and public health in the region. Should I have them come up? Next, we have Dr. Myriam J.A, who is an assistant professor of UMBC's Department of Emergency and Disaster Health Systems. Ming is a researcher and educator specializing in emergency management and disaster resilience. Her work focuses on community-based participatory research to understand the perceptions of vulnerable communities regarding health, climate change, and law enforcement. Ming is actively involved in projects related to refugee resettlement and public safety, and she collaborates with scholars across multiple states. Her research integrates academic study with practical applications, including the creation of disaster resilience hubs and culturally competent education programs. All right, and our last panelist is Hemant Chaloori, is a second-year graduate student pursuing a master's in human-centered computing at UMBC. Originally from, I should have practiced this before, I apologize, Vishakhapatnam in southern India. Hemant has several years of experience working in design and technology with companies like IBM and Dassault Systems, where he helped solve complex design challenges. Passionate about user experience and technology, Hemant will also share a personal story about witnessing a community-impacting weather event during his high school years, drawing a connection to resilience in the face of natural disasters. All right. So I have questions, and feel free to interpret them however you would like. And I realize I should have sent them to you before, so I apologize. But no, there are no gotcha questions. But the first one, and these kind of come from the book, kind of the themes and topics that the library proposed, but tying back to the book. But the first question really is just, how does reading fiction about the experiences of people living through disasters impact how you approach your own work or your own discovery or your own understanding on disasters and disaster recovery?
Should I go?
Yeah, you can just go down the line.
No worries. Reading fiction it's the. I am from the islands, so I have personal experience with disasters, whether they be hurricanes or floods, etc. And I'm also a disaster scholar. So the book for me, I particularly enjoyed the book because there were so many salient themes, actual themes that island communities experience both before, during, and after a disaster that was so beautifully captured. And also the various types of conflicts between, for example, international disaster response teams and what the international community may think islanders need as opposed to what they need themselves. And how these communities just go on, irrespective of the fact that they encounter such horrendous events, and it impacts their lives not just for a year or two, but for a lifetime. Somehow, some way, these people continue to go on and live and so on. So, yeah, I think the book beautifully captured those things that I was already familiar with. Yes.
Yes, I have been enjoying reading this book so much. Yeah, although it's a fiction book, but it really, like Farrah said, captures the individual experiences as well as the community shared experience about the trauma, about the loss and grief, and how a community can be resilient to recover from the significant consequences of a disaster, how people went through the extreme event to provide support for each other. Yes, like Farrah said, those themes are important for us to understand how individuals, how their cultural identities shape their views and experience of disasters. And we really need to understand those experiences to understand how a community respond and recover from a disaster. Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously my fellow panelists already covered most of the points, but one thing I would like to say is that what stood out for me from the book is that how well it explained the fragility of life and how important the community resilience is in when you're recovering from a disaster. And the reason I enjoyed the book a lot because I myself I also have a personal experience being one of the victims of a cyclone storm in my hometown, Vishakhapatnam, and it was really a very disastrous storm, and I saw with my own eyes how much time it took for the community to restore and how the community came together for that restoration process. And that made me realize at a very young age how important these factors are in restoring, and also how helpful if the international aid is provided or how global engagement was also involved in these things. So I think the book really crafted telling each stories, because through this book I understood because people have their individual stories. You never know what's happening in their case, and this book crafted really well what's happening in their story, and it gave us an opportunity to see put ourselves in their shoes and understand how impactful that was. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Great. And so kind of following up on that and thinking about, themes of resilience and how people think and engage with disasters. So while the book really deals with deep tragedy and trauma, it's also sprinkled with joy. So we have Leopold's recollection of taking his daughter to see the scarlet ibises. the description of Richard's feelings of freedom when he dives into the ocean, Diodone and Sonia's companionship and love is described, and Sarah and Oliver's stories of building a family and a home together, just to name a few of the specific examples of the book of joy that I think, Farah, you also mentioned, right? People are living through these processes. You all kind of mentioned that as well. But often when we talk about disasters, we flatten people's experiences to the tragic. And so within these moments, how do we both honor the tragedy while still staying true to the humanity of those experiencing the disaster? Either, you can talk about it from the work, but also maybe from your personal experiences. And what, if any, is the role of joy in disaster relief?
Again, just randomly, or we're just going down the line?
Either way, we can go in a different order this time to not make it feel so linear.
That's quite
So.
fine. Would you like me to go ahead? Yeah, sure. Joy. How do you define joy, though?
That's up to you. I think that's part of the question. I think that's So.
So for example, in 2017, Hurricane Maria basically devastated several islands in the Caribbean, and I remember when I went back home, about 4 months later, I literally could not recognize my island because everything was brown. Like there's just lush tropical country, and the impact of the hurricane was so intense that it literally burned the landscape. And then as I was driving from the airport, there was a guy on the sidewalk selling coconuts. I don't know. We must have gone to forage the coconut somewhere, from the mountainside. And people were living their lives because I think what I can say from my experiences interacting with islanders is that life has to go on. And so even if the event happens now, people take joy and comfort in knowing, okay, my family is okay. When I can come back outside, there are neighbors that I recognize, and they are okay. That brings me joy. And then we as a community, we can come together and figure out how are we going to survive this event. And then we come together, we cook. If you don't have something, I give it to you if I have it. And so it's this sort of humanity in such a difficult situation, I think, that brings a sense of joy. There's also joy and comfort in knowing that your neighbors across the sea, other islanders, know what you're going through, and they very gladly respond to you. Help comes in even if you're not asking for it. And so there is that. And then from the international perspective, once the story gets out there, people begin to ask, how can I help? And so I think there is an intense joy in knowing that, yes, the world is a crazy place, but somehow during these very difficult times, we find a level of humanity that helps us to get through. And so there's, I think, joy and resilience, or joy and grit, intimately interwoven in such tragic times. That's the perspective and the lens that I look at it from. Yeah.
For me, I think joy might be from the recognition of the cultural practices. How, for example, like the spiritual support, how people can recover from, go through the emotional, those kind of psychological loss, that kind of process, how through cultural practices, like Sarah's case, right, through those kind of rituals, spiritual connection with her daughters, and how to identify our cultural understanding about life, about death, that kind of process. And also the recognition of the community solidarity, right? Like Farah mentioned about how a community can work together, can support each other. A lot of stories from the book demonstrate that, the power of the shared experience. Yeah.
Sharing of rainwater, for example.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked a question. What is the definition? What do you mean by joy? So it means things for different for different person, right? So for me, in my personal experience, joy to me was I was 16 back when this happened, and we all are so busy in our lives, and we all are disconnected from each other in the neighborhood, and nobody knows anyone. At least I didn't know anyone. But during this disaster, people came together and how they helped each other. And I didn't know most of the people, and they were like, "Do you guys need some help?" And because our own home was destroyed, and we needed help taking off the things, right? So people came together and they helped us. They were so kind, and this is when I realized the importance of humanity. And that is joy to me. Even though even though it is a time of even though we are in the middle of a disaster, but still that was the point where I realized, okay, how important it is to be kind and be human also, right? So yeah, that was a joy for me in this experience, and that's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that you all question that, what does even joy mean? And part of the motivation for the question is, I think often when we talk about disaster, particularly when we look at disasters elsewhere from that outside lens, we flatten it, this tragic. Yes. And I think instead of, kind of in that question, things you all talked about, humanity, solidarity, cultural practices, religion, resilience, these are not often the things that are seen in the news. Instead, it's almost like a form of disaster tourism in the news, and it flattens the experiences of the people going through it. So how do you think the news, this is not about the people on the ground who experience it, but what role do the news and other people kind of communicating the disaster? It's important in terms of raising money, but also, what is the role of that in communicating what is and is not happening, and how does that impact, how people experience it on the ground?
First. Yeah, actually, I was thinking about that. I was thinking, when I read the book, I feel like, yeah, it's amazing because a lot of, we haven't heard about the survivors' stories, individual experiences. Like the news coverage always focuses on the response, right? Like Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton, it's always about the response phase. And we don't hear about the individual stories, right? And those individual stories are so important for us to understand the existing vulnerabilities in each community, and how the disaster exacerbate the existing vulnerability, and what are the specific communities' needs. We really need to understand all of those so that our response and the recovery and the disaster aids could be effective to really help the community. And about how we understand the cultural differences of different communities, what they really need from the nonprofit organizations, from the governmental agencies. And we don't hear about those stories a lot. So that's why I think, yeah, this book is so powerful.
Yeah, so my understanding of the question is basically you're asking how come these the news, the communicating this disaster is not joyful, and why not, and why is it why they're talking about the disaster itself, and maybe there is a reason for it because in my opinion I think it's important to explain the gravity of the situation to the people so that the international funding organizations or anyone who can support us, right, and that's one of the reasons why it is not meant to be joyful at least. But talking about individual stories and how they overcome the situation, that can be showed as a joyful experience because that can be inspiring for the people and how they can act in such conditions, right? So yeah, that's the way I would think of that as well. Yeah.
You don't get to see stories of the absolute heroism of people on the ground, right? The man who thought he was going to drown because the river actually was in his house, and he put his kids in a barrel and actually had them sit in the barrel on top of like a counter on his house. The people who put their kids in cupboards so that nothing happens to them, the people who walk for hours so that they can get, some sort of relief or rescue. The stories of heroism within these contexts, you don't really hear about those things. And then the news, it's about the here and now. So the news cycles will usually cover the story for a week, even a couple of months afterwards. There may be one or two articles that may follow up, but the story of long-term recovery, you don't hear those things. And I remember I went to the USVI as part of a reconnaissance group after Hurricane Maria and Irma, and it was several months afterwards, and this is one of the things. And then years afterwards again, like everybody had forgotten about it, but these communities, they were still plugging away, right? They were figuring, you don't hear the stories of the farmers who have to figure out how to replant crops when nothing is left. Either it's flood or just the wind can be so strong, it literally uproots everything from the ground. You don't hear those stories. The stories of people figuring out how to make miracles out of nothing. The news focuses on the devastation. Everything is sensational, but you don't get to see the human. It's sort of like sort of flowers emerging out of ruins. You don't get to see those beautiful moments or those beautiful stories, unfortunately. Yeah.
That leads very well to my next question. So as Tafia, Sarah, Malu, and Oliver recount in the book, there's the disaster itself, and then there's the recovery, which can sometimes prove to be equally dire for communities. And I think the book goes into great detail about that. And not everyone experiences recovery in the same way. For example, Leopold gets taken to a hospital for foreigners and returns to Trinidad, while Haitians who lost their homes and had no other alternatives, so they talked about that difference between the people who were forced in the camps and the people whose houses were saved, or who had other places to go. And in the tent, they were forced in these tent cities only to deal with, lack of resources and violence, especially gendered violence and rape. And so class, access, and nationality influences how people experience the aftermath of these disasters. So in what ways do disasters exacerbate existing systems of inequality, and how can and should responses to disaster take this into consideration?
Should I go ahead? I think the story of Sonia sort of like captures this. She's doing things that women are told they're not supposed to do to make a living, but she survives, right? And then not only does she survive, but through the individual stories, you can see how she's interwoven into those. And then even at the very end, somehow she along with Malu, they're able to go and release the bones. They're able to go on this sort of like new journey. And I think for me that was one of those stories that was actually quite important, because she wasn't from the bourgeois class in Haiti, for example. Neither was she employed in a quote-unquote well-respected job. So she had all of the, I guess, attributes or characteristics that would have made her not survive, but somehow she did. And again, it goes back to the community pulling together, the resilience of the community. And even Malu, who would have been considered quote-unquote vulnerable, right? She's just a market lady, but she's the pillar of the story. Because although financially speaking, you probably might consider her to be relatively poor, and poverty is a form of vulnerability, but she's resilient because she has this social capital, which is a form of wealth that unfortunately oftentimes is not captured in the news stories or in people's understanding of disasters. It is this intangible wealth that actually allows a community to overcome. And so in discourses of vulnerability, I think oftentimes we focus on financial vulnerability or inequality when it comes to like political class, socioeconomic class, but we tend to forget that in a disaster, those things are actually erased. And at the end of the day, whether you got $1 million in the bank, you can't access it at the moment because, hey, the bank is damaged, financial systems may be down. You've got to turn to your humanity and see your neighbor as equal in order to get through the moment. And for me, Sonia's story was able to highlight that or shed a light on that very, very well. So vulnerability does exist. There are various nuances. Yes, there's socioeconomic class. And the socioeconomic class actually determine how the disaster itself impacts you. But at the end of the day, people who are rich in social capital tend to get through one of events like this very well. And this is an intangible wealth that oftentimes it's not captured. So, yes.
I think you really captured it really well. Talking about the Sonia character, that's what I was about to bring up too, because it's through that character we understood how people from different races or different backgrounds can also come together in the situations and how they struggle through these things. And I think, yeah, you really covered everything what I wanted to say. Yeah. So I don't have anything to add. Sorry.
I would like to add a little bit more on what Farah said. But speaking of vulnerability, there are so many factors contribute to a community's vulnerability, right? Like gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, all of those. So for us, for disaster response and recovery, we really need to recognize the existing vulnerability in each community. Like the gender inequality in our society, right, and the sex violence in those camps, how those vulnerable factors might be exacerbated after a disaster, and so for disaster response, we really need to understand for policy making, for resource allocation, how we can recognize those existing vulnerabilities and to empower those disadvantaged communities so that they can build their adaptive capacity to deal with disasters.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Or? Okay. All right. So it kind of ties into some of the things you all are saying. Another question I had was that, stories of kinship, familial, and community ties. And I'm intentional that I think, separating the three, even though they're very interwoven and interrelated in life and in the story, they're really prevalent throughout the book. And while they're central to people's lives before the earthquake, as Farah, you were mentioning, they become even more important during the aftermath and response to the earthquake through pooling of resources and informal networks of care. And we see that, with Malu and Loco taking care of Sarah after Jonas dies. This is, one of, tons of examples in the book. But what role do these relationships play in formal disaster relief? And response, and how can outside groups, and you all have touched on this, but I want to kind of drill down on this a little more, how can outside groups be more effective in leveraging existed informal structures in the way that support instead of alienating people on the ground? And when I thought about alienating people on the ground, they used the example of, Anne used the example of the, giving, the people who were making shelters, experimenting, giving them to, was the camp administrator, right? And the camp administrator in the space where Malu was saying, put his separate and made himself separate, but then they all piled kind of his trash up against his house, right? So they're kind of performing these ideas of, well, you think you're better than us, but this is actually what we think, right? But so I'm thinking about how, right, so kind of within this context, like we have these informal cares, these informal networks, but they're not used in ways, I think, that are often productive. So if y'all could talk about, again, what role do these relationships play in formal response to disaster, and how can outside groups more effectively leverage existing informal structures in the way that support instead of alienating people?
So I know that exists not just for people in the Caribbean and Central and South America, but also for Asia as well. There is a humongous diaspora community, and there's something that we call remittances. And so people who are from Haiti, so there's the Haitian economy, the formal Haitian economy, and then there's the Haitian economy that includes remittances from Haitians in the diaspora, and that is the case for most countries in the quote-unquote global south, okay? And these huge networks, they're not utilized post-disaster. NGOs don't go to diaspora communities and say, how do we partner with you so that we can build on the networks that you have that already exist in the community, and so that we can partner with you to know what actually is going on, what actually needs to be done, and then how do we get those needs met? And I think that's a huge area of collaboration that is sadly overlooked, but has tremendous potential, because the diaspora community, they are the ones, particularly in impoverished places like Haiti, who build communities. They are the ones who send money to the communities to build homes. They help with hospitals. Even when the international relief is done, so the cameras are off and it's not focused, these are the people who continue to help with the recovery efforts. And so I think NGOs need to partner with diaspora communities and organizations to help ensure that aid gets to the community that needs it, and also to help them to understand what actually is going on, what the nuances in the community actually are, so that they can better target the aid and recovery efforts. Yeah.
I think to integrate those informal community resources and networks into the formal disaster response, it requires a relationship building before the disaster, right? We need to build the trust, to build the bridges among different communities, between the emergency managers and the vulnerable communities, so that they know who are the community leaders, so that they can reach out to those community leaders when a disaster happens. I think that's very important. So thinking about those extreme scenarios, events, at that moment, you are overwhelmed. You don't have additional resources to reach out to each community member. But if you already have the relationship, you already have the network, so that you can reach out to each community's leaders so that they can mobilize their own community's resources. I think that's very important.
Yeah, so I can talk about the experience I had when I was in Vizag and when this happened. So when the hudud, the cyclone that I was talking about happened, the people who are not in Vizag, the people who relocated to different countries or different places, they also started sending the funds, obviously, to help economy again, like to help the restoration process be quicker, right? So I strongly feel, that had a really good impact, and that's what my understanding of this question is so far, and how important that was, and I think that really had a good impact on recovering the Vizag as quick as possible. So that's what I can add one point regarding this,
I like guessing my next question, because my next question was about diaspora. So I think the book goes through different diasporic experiences. You have Richard, who left Haiti behind and cut off all ties except for business ties, but right before he's killed is kind of expressing, or the wave, we don't know what happened, but the wave comes, expressing this desire to reconnect with his past. We have Didier, who follows musical passions to the States, only to be confronted with racism and poverty, and Anne, who, was an architect trained abroad and who does this international aid work. So she's complicating what the diasporic experience is to start with. I think is one theme she's kind of doing throughout the entire book is complicating and making us remember that it's not the Haitian diasporic community. There's different ways to be within that space. But they all respond really differently to the earthquake, right? DDR is devastated and paralyzed and returns to Haiti, but then is overwhelmed about her attempts to help, right? She can't, and Malu is finally like, you need to leave. Like this is too much for you. But then, we have a more kind of hopeful and beautiful moment at the end where she, kind of designs what the cathedral could look for and what would it mean for a Haitian to design their own space, and then goes back with Malu to wash the bones. So we kind of see evolution of Anne. And we don't know what Richard's response is because Richard's in his death there's a perpetuation of kind of different responses of others, particularly Malu. And so I think, and Farah, you answered a lot of this question, but there is one part I'll ask for the other two. Kind of what are Farah talked a little bit about the roles of the diaspora and disasters. But then I'm thinking too of, what are some things that we can do? You did kind of answer this, the things we can do to kind of use and leverage this, the diasporic community. But the question you didn't ask that I want to think about though is also though, how do their diasporic realities and disconnects from their homeland hinder their efforts? Because I think it's both, they have this huge resource, and I think, after the earthquake in Haiti, there was a kind of critical crowdsourced mapping that was going on of the Haitian diaspora that was, both kind of translating from Creole into English so a response could be done, but also trying to crowdsource map using kind of open source mapping around, kind of where things should have been, so people on the ground could do that. But at the same time, particularly Anne's response, but I would also say DDR's response, there's also the diaspora is different than the people who are living there. So I guess, so that diasporic reality and disconnects from their homeland hinder their efforts as well as helps.
A very good diaspora experience that I can share is during the Ebola crisis. So I worked with, well, at the time we were both students at UDEL, but she's West African, and she actually did research on West African immigrants living in Delaware, Philly, Maryland, Washington, D.C. area. And how they literally were so pivotal in helping various communities like Sierra Leone, Ghana, and various places actually cope with. They sent not just money, but medical supplies. They were important in helping to talk with local community members, even at the federal level, to help people actually understand what was going on here, to help people to allay fears, because people thought that as long as you're African, it doesn't matter where from the African continent you are, you're carrying with you Ebola, that type of a thing. So apart from natural hazards like hurricanes and so on, the diaspora community also helps during like pandemics and stuff like that. But there can also be a disconnect, particularly if you've got people who are perhaps exiled from their home country, or people who have considered themselves to be in self-exile for whatever reason. And there can also be a disconnect if people have sort of like lost that cultural affiliation with their country. We sort of categorize them as the other. They've become as foreign as a foreigner themselves. And so the interpretation and the nuances of the country, the political climate, etc., that too may go over their heads, particularly during these intense periods. So yes, there can be moments of conflict, absolutely.
So in my opinion, what I can say in the diaspora, you have different types of people, and different people have different stories or purpose of moving the home country and going to a different place. So they have their personal stories, and some of them can be a negative reasons also for leaving the home country. Maybe they were not comfortable living there, and they have they didn't want to continue living there, and they want to have a disconnect from the hometown itself for some personal reasons maybe. So maybe for those people, for those particular set of people, they might not want to be included in this, and that these reasons can be one of the reasons why they don't want to participate in such things, right? So, but again, there are some people who also still are connected, who did not disconnect with the community or from the hometown, and still want to willing to help. So, if you ask me, what would be the hindering effects that they can't contribute during these events, would be their personal reason or personal choices or the personal relationship with the hometown. But as a human, I feel everyone would do their part in helping, right? So that's what I think about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, all the discussions remind me about what I have learned from the refugee communities. I have worked with refugee communities in the U.S. a lot. I've seen a lot of they might, some of them, they might lost their cultural affiliation, connection with their home countries, but they established very strong, close-knit community in the U.S. That's their resilience. Like, for example, for some communities from Myanmar, like they have very close ethnic community, yeah, among people. They don't need to interact with the broader society. Yes. Within their community, they have everything they need. On the one hand, that kind of community connection provides very strong support for their community members. But in disaster response, in disaster management, that might hinder them to work with other community. So we need to understand that how we can, again, build the bridge with them so that for disaster response, the whole community needs to work together. They need to understand the social norms and the governmental instructions about how to take actions, take preventive actions, how to respond to a disaster. Yeah.
And even the messages, for example, national or state messages that can be translated to this community so they understand what is actually going on. Because a lot of the times we think that, a lot of the times when communication efforts are made, particularly for risk reduction or even warnings, hazard is coming and so on, this does not translate into every community based on like cultural background and stuff like that. So for the diaspora community, being able to translate important information, not just into their language, but in a way that they would actually understand the gravity of the situation or what exactly is needed. I know we normally do, for example, the Spanish and so on, but a lot of other cultural groups tend to be left out. And so that could be a potential consideration as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for.
Great. And so kind of thinking about this and thinking about the diaspora, but also the people living in these spaces, an overarching theme of the book is home. So it's either kind of figuratively or literally, like Tafia longs to go back to her physical home she lost during the earthquake, or Leopold and Richard are simultaneously lamenting the loss of, but also reimagining their childhood home. Or Sarah kind of gives these rich descriptions of the home she built with Oliver for her and her family. So what does home and losing a home mean in the context of disasters?
Well, I think I want to take this first because, So, as I was talking about my own personal experience, our own home was destroyed during in the disaster, in the hurricane, and so I was still in high school, and I don't know how much impact it would have financially or anything. My father would have better idea, but still, I being the victim in my own house, when I clearly remember the scene when this was happening, I was in my bedroom, and I was looking out the window, and the wind was so fast, it was so loud, and a lot of happening. It was so raining, it's so harsh, and I was scared inside. And there was no electricity, there was no power. Everything was dark. But still, then I heard a big sound of my the penthouse that we had on the top floor just flew off, and there was something collapsed on the floor, and something like big boom sound it came, and I was like, okay, something happened. And then when my dad, we all went together when the storm kind of became a bit better later, I saw everything was damaged, and it was a lot of financial damage for us, right? And apart from financial damage, it was also about a personal connection to you. We had memories in that room, and it was also a personal loss for you in a way, right? That is something that you can't get back. And also financially, it took some time for us to recover, building that again. And also our government in India also had a scheme for people who lost homes like this. They provided some funds for people to again build if there is a house damage or anything, right? So that really helped for the financial part or for the recovering part. But still, when it comes to memories, nothing could help for that, right? So this is one of the impacts that you could have in these experiences, right? So yeah.
So the interesting thing about home, at least in a Caribbean context, you know that you can lose it every year, multiple times a year. So and then you can become. There are people who actually are now afraid of rain, even within their own home because of the experience. So you may be able to physically build back a structure, but the impact, sort of like the psychological trauma from an event can sort of change your relationship to home, particularly when you know every year it could get damaged, every year you could lose it, something could happen. And so I think that's something that I felt it was important to share as well. And then home also is the community. It's that place where you know your neighbors will help you, even though you may lose your physical home. And so home, to me, at least within the Caribbean context, it's not just your individual dwelling, but it's also your community. Because every year that community basically supports you, it helps you, it's your lifeline, particularly if an event should happen. So there are various nuances. Yes.
Did you have anyone to add?
No.
Okay. So I want to switch to, I mean, we've touched on this, but explicitly or intentionally, thinking about the role of international aid in disaster relief. So on page 230, Oliver asks, and I quote, "Imagine if every Haitian who lost someone could get their hands on some of that money." And he's talking about the money that was being raised by the international community to do disaster relief. So imagine if everyone who lost somebody could get their hands on some of that money, decided what they needed for themselves, their families. You could create a healthy working middle class, and still there would be millions amassing in a treasure trove behind them. But of course, they won't allow that to happen. So how, if at all, can our approach to international aid shift so it's empowering to the people receiving that aid? And what is the role of mutual aid and self-determination in the face of disasters?
Aid should go to the communities that need it. I understand. And I know that even now in some financial international financial arrangements, that is a thing. The government cannot necessarily touch the money that is being given to a community for a particular purpose because it's like a sieve, a strainer, for example. It's a bucket with very, very many holes. It gets into the hands of the government, and somehow there is a disconnect between that and what the community actually gets. And the unfortunate thing with aid, it's an outsider's idea most of the times of what the local community needs. It's not necessarily the community saying for themselves, this is what we need, this is how we would appreciate you helping us, this is what would be most beneficial. We've got to take what the international community is giving us and try to make it work for us and fit our needs. And then the gaps, we fill that in with help from the diaspora or the stuff that we can do on our own. There are times, for example, in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, the banks just weren't working. So even though you may give money to the government and stuff like that, access to it may be difficult because systems may be down and so on. So e-finance, for example, figuring out other ways, for example, of loan repayments and stuff like that, even debt forgiveness for a country after a particular hazardous, a terrifying event could actually be quite helpful, because then you may give the government some sort of grace period, or they may not necessarily have to repay a loan or a debt, and then they can use that money for rebuilding the country, for assisting the various communities that may need it. But during or after a disaster or hazard event, international organizations and so on should definitely think of working directly with the community. And then in cases where accountability is needed, we can use technology such as blockchain technology to ensure that we have an open and honest system of so that we can track where the money goes and ensure that it goes actually to the people that need it the most. But definitely the community should have a say in determining what we need, how we need it, how best it should be dispersed so that we can rebuild and help ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, so you actually said the same things that I wanted to say, but unfortunately that's the reality of the world. Yes. It's the harsh reality of the world where it still happens, where you still get the funds and it doesn't reach the right people. There are people who take advantage of these things, and
they've got very large invisible pockets.
Exactly. And it's the same case in India too. And I myself, I see people, like when we actually submitted requests for our home, and we did get some funding, and there are people who had no damage and they also got the funding. But to me, I was like, back then, I didn't, it's okay. That's how the government is. And I've been seeing it, and even now it is in a way. And I strongly feel it's not only in India, I think it's anywhere else. But what things we can do to prevent that? Like you said, making sure it's, better verification process, that it reaches the community. And also I think this is something that people also should be, the responsible feeling that the people who are working on these funds should also be responsible for the funds, that making sure they're reached. And it's a personal quality. It's not something in our hands. It's something that in their hands. And it's having some motivation about these things to the staff, explaining them how important it is. And maybe that can change them a bit. But at the end, I think it's still the same. And I really hope that can improve at some point of time,
There are always gaps. Excuse me. Between the international aids and the community's needs. As you two mentioned about, we need to empower the community, to let the community's voices being heard. How we can do that? I think we need to educate the community members to make sure they need to work hard to make their communities more visible in the broader society. They need to be actively involved in the decision-making process about the policies. And community members should be motivated to join those organizations, to allocate resources, to provide direct assistance for their own communities. They need to be empowered to have the capacity to work with the policymakers, decision makers, and to work with those international organizations.
So, for example, when Sarah's husband went into the desert for this supposedly new facility that was going to revolutionize and it never came, right? Because these were people who wanted to build a structure in a place that wasn't conducive. So it's this meaning well, but not taking the time to research and understand how this thing would actually work. Can it actually work in the context that you want it to work? And What does the community think of it, and what do they actually need? Just taking the extra steps to do that, I think, would be very helpful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Geographer Neil Smith makes the argument that there's no such thing as a natural disaster.
That is very true. That is 100% very true. Yes.
I agree. I'm glad you agree. So I don't need to convince you all. That's great. So what he means by that, for those of you who don't know, is that there's natural phenomenon, right? So there's hurricanes, there's earthquakes, but we call them natural disasters, and I was actually very intentional never to use the term natural disaster. But it becomes a disaster because of lack of preparedness, of inequitability. And if we notice that, it is, in talking about Helene, it was rural communities, it was mobile homes were more impacted. And it wasn't because it's these systems of oppression and marginalization that makes these communities more vulnerable. So because we all agree with that, we don't have to argue about that one. But how can we use tools like disaster preparedness? You've talked a lot about resilience, building resilience within communities before these disasters occur, and knowledge about how to respond and prepare. So these natural phenomena, we know they're going to continue to occur, but moving away from the impact. What can we do? What's your expert advice on? And I know it's like a huge loaded question that there's actually no answer to, but.
I mean, there's one thing in what I can think of in this. This is why it is really important for the international connections and global engagement, because that way you can use the technologies, you can transfer the technologies that you can use in these particular disasters, because not every country is economically developed or even technologically development, and the advancements are different from country to country, right? So let's say to recover in these such disasters, there is a good technology that's being built upon in different countries. Maybe the international connections or the global engagement through this, if they support you, and we can use those here, in that way, that can help us recover faster. But yeah, that's one thing I can think of, and that's how I feel it's important. That's why I feel it's also important for this global engagement in these conditions, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in the disaster space, we abhor the use of natural disasters, and then although it's perpetuated in the media, it's one of the things that we wish media people would stop doing, because there are root causes, basically underlying sort of like fractures or seizures in every society that makes one group of people more vulnerable than another. And it's also greed. People building in areas that are prone to floods, for example. Floods are natural, they're going to happen. A tornado is going to happen, an earthquake is going to happen, but these root causes basically puts people in harm's way. And so these are the things that need to be addressed. And also, we can't talk about addressing those things without talking about policies, and also addressing historical injustices, etc., which play a role in determining, for example, within the U.S. context, where people live, what type of access do certain groups have to funding, even knowledge, the ability to know and understand what am I vulnerable to when I'm moving into an area, and if something should happen, to whom can I turn? Where can I get help and assistance? How do I qualify for that? All of these underlying factors determine how well people actually recover from a hazard event, and then it also unfortunately determines who gets impacted most often. So there's nothing natural about it. It's you can see the fingerprints of injustices and inequity in how people are impacted from an event. So, yes.
Yes, I totally agree. There's no natural disasters. So we need to recognize how marginalized communities, they are disproportionately affected by disasters, right? We have seen so many disasters affect those communities. a lot. Yeah, so I think that means preparedness matters. Yeah, we need to think about how to help those communities prepare, like Farrell mentioned about the resource allocation, right? How to recognize the existing inequities in our society and how to work with those specific communities. Yeah, I think actually to be the basic thing is raising awareness to let people know what are the risks, what are the potential hazards in our community. So I've been asking these questions to so many people. Do you have an emergency plan? Do you know what you need to do when a disaster, like right now, if there is a warning of tornado or flash flood, what you will do? If you are separated from your family members, do you have any way to contact your family members? All of those small details, small questions, we just need to raise people's awareness. For everybody need to think about those, right? That kind of continuous engagement, education, training, all kinds of workshops are really important to empower each community.
Yeah, and as we know, everything is connected, and like you said, awareness is important. And how is that provided, in my opinion? Through books like this, because it gives the opportunity to tell these stories, and through these stories, you're telling how important it is to be prepared for these disasters. So, yeah, that's what
And I'm sorry I didn't have any specific people from the disaster community to quote for that. I had to pull from what I knew. So with that, kind of thinking about this, what does it mean to recover from a disaster? So who gets to decide? And what steps can we take to ensure everyone, not just the wealthiest or land speculators or business investors, and describes them on page 258 as disaster vultures, benefit from disaster recovery? So it's kind of three different questions.
Who gets to decide who recover? That's quite a good question. Does a community ever recover? That would be my question, because even though the reconstruction may have taken place, the psychological impact of the disaster, of the event, of the hazard remains. Like I say, if you go to the Caribbean right now and you start to interview people, you will find people who are actually terrified of the rain. They're triggered anytime it starts to rain very heavily because they remember what happened. How do we define recovery? I think that the definition of recovery has to be expanded, because recovery, so far we've taken particularly in the disaster space, we've taken more of a structural approach to talking about disaster recovery. We assume that recovery occurs when the roads are rebuilt, the houses are rebuilt, people can go back safely into their homes and stuff like that. But we tend to not address the lingering psychological impact, even the disturbances to the cultural growth or the integration of a community. All of these intangible things are impacted. And I haven't seen very clearly how these are properly restored. So I don't necessarily know or think that a community ever really recovers from a disaster event. Yeah. Because it is not something that people take the time to address, you know what I mean? Life happens, you've got to continue, but the scars remain. Yeah.
Yeah, but so I totally agree with you. That it's a good question to think if the community does ever recover, right? But in my experience, I think it does, but it takes a lot of time. It depends on how much bad the disaster is and how much it affected you, be it the damage, both psychological or physical damage, whatever it is. Because I did see with my own eyes how Isaac recovered within few months or a year. Because when the disaster happened, the whole city was destroyed. The roads were blocked, the trees were all over the place, and there was houses destroyed, and people were injured and everything. But then, it took a lot of struggle for us to recover. We had to rebuild everything, restore a lot. But at the end, now it's again back to its own shape.
But
It
is that recovery or reinvention?
um,
Do you see what I mean? Like the state that you were in before the event, even though you have the physical structures and stuff like that, you're still not the same. Meaning, like not you as an individual, but your community. Like you had to recreate something to move forward. At least that is my interpretation of most communities who have been through traumatic hazard or disaster events. I think you reinvent in order to continue, but I don't know that people necessarily. Anyway, it's just my perspective. But
No, I totally see it. That's how it should be also.
Yeah,
That would be
yeah.
great if that happens. But in reality, I think in realistic terms, I think people try to recreate it instead of reinventing.
Yeah.
Right?
You see, there we go.
So that means disasters could be opportunities,
Yes.
right? So it's about, so how we can improve, how we can learn from the previous disasters so that we can build a more resilient community.
It's like a
to-
double-edged sword. So
Yes,
it's
yes,
destructive,
yes.
But it also provides opportunities to right what wasn't right in there
Mm-hmm.
in the first place.
Yeah, I feel like we haven't paid enough attention to recovery, basically, and especially the long-term recovery.
Yes.
Yeah, so,
yes, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, I agree with you too about the kind, and it's a learning. Everything is a learning experience for sure. But I think the part of the question was also making sure not the rich people get recovered, but also the poor people, right? For that, I think again, this is where the answer to the previous question comes at making sure the things are really well set in, making sure or you verify that it reaches the right people in the government, employing those systems and also motivating them, educating them how important this is. And also I think the people should also take the responsibility that they have the right to ask for it. I think they can't just leave and just give up, and it's a quality that should be built in people as well so that they can stand up and ask for what they need. Right? They can come together, and because they came together when to recover, why can't they come together to ask for what they need also, right? For the support.
But the issue with recovery, right, is the physical structures may be repaired, but for example, the underlying inequities or inequalities still remains, right? The power class or the social system still remains. So that's why I'm reluctant to say that communities actually recover in that sense, because the root causes that cause that thing
difference.
oftentimes is not addressed, right?
Yeah.
How many times do people overthrow their government and demand a more just system after an event? People are more concerned with, I want to build my home back, I want to get my job so that I can take care of my kids and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
No, I understand, and that's how the world is like.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Unfortunately, and I wish that changes soon.
Yes.
So closely related, and the last question. In light of Oliver's critiques about white saviors and the way disaster aid is distributed and used, and I think thinking, Ming, as well as this idea that you're talking about disaster as opportunity, and I was thinking particularly about Anne, and I believe it was Lucien's story about, architect, engineer who are Haitian, who want to be part of building something new and creating something new. What can we do as individuals and as a country to respond to disasters better, both in the U.S., because I think we often talk about disasters as outside, but I mean, it happens here as well, but both within the U.S. context and abroad.
For me, I think there's like several different avenues or ways to look at that. One, indigenous architecture. There is this incredible African architecture from Burkina Faso. He won, I think, one of the highest architectural prizes. I, for the life of me, cannot remember his name right now. Francis something. But he has reinvented architectural styles for many African countries, using traditional architecture that already was resilient, but I guess people figured they were built by Africans, so they weren't. And then putting that in a modern design. And that could be an option. Build, and even Anne, for example, her story sort of like encapsulates that to a certain extent. These architects and engineers who live in these environments know the nuances of their country. For example, in many Caribbean islands, there are things that's called guts or dry rivers, meaning that you may live in an area for 10 years and never know that you built your house in an area that is going to get flooded during heavy periods of rain. But if you employ local architects and engineers and stuff like that who knows the area, who are familiar with the stories, the lay of the land and so on, you have an opportunity to build actually very good structures in areas that are safe, as opposed to continuously seeking for international architects, constructors, engineers, that type of a thing. So that's one aspect of that. And in a U.S. context, I think helping get the community involved and disasters and various scholars involved when you're building communities. These are one of the things that we often don't talk about as well. What was the other aspect of your question?
I guess just how can we respond as individuals and as a country?
And as individuals, we need to demand more from our leaders, honestly. Because I think most of the times we don't understand that we're sort of like living on a knife's edge. For many people, one event is going to totally upset their entire lives. We need to demand more, better policies, better building codes, better response mechanisms, greater accountability for where money goes and why. This is one of the ways I think we can begin to ensure that the people we elect work for us and not necessarily against us. I think those two things are very important. Sorry, I'm just passing.
Yeah, I think, oh, yeah, go ahead if you want. Okay, so I think, again, talking about, so since I'm representing Center for Global Engagement, I feel like I'm talking about global engagement most of the time, but still, that's still important, right? Because like Farah mentioned that about international architects coming into picture and how this is where all the people come together and help the communities restore and recover faster, employing this architecture practices well, and we are in advancing as a US. I think we are also advancing in the technology really fast, and I think we are at a good stage, and making sure this is also being shared everywhere on the disastrous context and these recovery context itself. I think that would be helpful for the other communities also to recover faster. So that's one thing I can think of. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you two have covered what I want to say. Farah, you mentioned that we need to take an extra step to understand the community, right? That's something I wanted to emphasize. Yeah, for policymakers, for the whole nation, for the country to effectively respond to a disaster, sometimes it's not as simple as just issue an evacuation order, right? We need to think about, does that order make sense for our community, and what might be the obstacles for our community members to take actions based on that. I wanted to use Hurricane Milton as an example. Because of Hurricane Helene, the Florida government really responded to Hurricane Milton. They issued an evacuation order, but it's like there are 6.5 million people needs to be evacuated, and the gas station, they don't have gas, and people were stuck on the highways.
Community lifelines, they were not ready.
Right. The infrastructure didn't work well to respond to that community needs. So for policymakers, for those people, we need to think about when we issue the evacuation order, does it work for our community? How we can build the essential community lifelines really work, functional for our community. That's very important. Yeah.
Maybe we could use airships to
Probably soon, yes. Soon, someday it's going to happen.
drones even.
Yeah.
All right, I want to thank our panelists for this insightful conversation and see if there's any questions from the audience. So, thank you. Are there questions from the audience?
My main question, I don't think I can, like, my main question is, how do you, before the hurricane or the natural, or the disaster, I'm not doing this for example, before those things happen, what should be in place as individual households, as community members, like, what can we do before the call to go get to a people, before those things start happening? What should we always have with us in order to help prepare us for these things that we know will happen?
Groceries?
So there are different levels of preparedness. So you're talking about like so you've got like individual level, you've got a household level, community, state, whatever. At a individual household level, so for example, if something were to happen to you right now, would you know to your house, or to the area that you live, would you know the safe exit route from your place to a place where you and your family members could gather, irrespective of where you guys are at the moment that the event happened? Most people don't have that. Like we have what we call an emergency checklist or an emergency preparedness checklist, and I think that this is something that community organizations can actually help people with, not just groceries and stuff like that, but also having an emergency contact, having an emergency exit plan. So, for example, if something should happen, where do we drive to meet up in the case of an event? Sometimes it's often in another county, it may be in another state, even depending on the extent of the incident. But having that plan in place, having an emergency fund, some sort of saving fund, something that you can dip into to support you and your family for a week, for 2 weeks, a month, if necessary. And being able to have an alternative method of communicating should your phone lines go down. I know that there are various apps that people use, but should you no longer have reception and it's an event, how do you contact your loved ones to ensure that everybody is safe, everybody knows where we're supposed to meet up and stuff like that? And also having an everyday carry, or this is not a gun, but it's what we call, most people have it as a backpack or a duffel bag, where you've got your emergency supplies. So you've got one in at work, you've got one at home, you've got one in your car, and ensuring that, for example, most people try to ensure that their place of worship has one, or the places that they visit the most often, whether it's your grandmother's house, your family's house, something like that. Ensuring that you have these bags or kits in these various places, because you never know in what condition, area you may be in when you're going to need it. So these are some of the things that I think we need to discuss a bit more and ensure that people are aware of and begin to practice and actually have, because you never know. You never know.
Yeah, thank you.
No,
You
no
pretty much
worries.
covered really good aspects. And I was actually making a joke with the groceries. But if I want to answer this question, there are two things here. How can you be prepared individually, and also how can the city be prepared for the disaster? If I want to answer as an individual personally for myself, the first thing would be, obviously, like you mentioned, the funding, to block in some fund for these cases, because you might have to use it for medical reason if you get injured, and or maybe to recover from the impact itself. And yeah, that's true. And again, it depends. Again, the practices, if it's about what kind of practices you can have to be prepared for these, it differs from a lot of things. One, it differs on the impact, how severe the storm or the disaster is going to be, because if it's too severe, it's not recommended to travel at that point of time, so you have to be in your house. let's say it's really close and you're not in a position to travel, it's not recommended to travel at that point in time, you're supposed to be at your house, making sure you are at a space where it doesn't have impact, even though it is huge, and making sure you prepare yourself to be in that part of the house or in that part of the place where it doesn't have much impact. And also, if possible, if it's not that severe, maybe go into your family, cousin's place or somewhere for some time, right? That is one thing you can do. But apart from this, I also still feel it's also important to have the supplies stored up, because the reason I'm focusing on that part is because in my case, after the disaster, it took 1.5 months for us to get the supplies or the food or anything to our house, because it was a huge disaster and we did not get any supplies. And I clearly remember that I think it was after a month, we had this huge line around I think around 1 mile that you have to wait for groceries, because they were very limited, and you have to wait. I think it was around half a mile or a mile that you were in the queue, and I was in the queue to get the groceries. And it's also, so this is one of the things that how you can be prepared in these in situations, right? And
then were you referring to a safe room?
exactly, yeah. So these are some of the practices that we can have in place to be prepared for the disasters. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit on that. In addition to emergency kits, those kind of stuff, the checklist are very important. You need to think about those extreme scenarios. Like, for example, if you need to evacuate and your car is parked in your garage, and when there is no power, probably you cannot open your garage door. That kind of very small things. We need to think about that, right? A lot of time we take for granted about what we are having now, but when a disaster happens, you might lose all the things you have, like for the perishable food in your refrigerator. If you during a flood you lost power for a week, how do you deal with that? Do you have the food?
A sub pump in your basement. Mandatory.
And in addition to that, I wanted to emphasize another thing, which is about how to stay informed. It's not only about those materials you need to prepare, right? It's also about you need to know what is the potential hazards in this area. And did you sign up any local alerts about emergencies, crisis, all that kind of thing. Stay informed, stay prepared. Yep.
If you go to California, for example, you definitely need to know how to deal with earthquakes, for example, right? Whereas here on the East Coast, it's more like hurricanes, snowstorms, a bit of tornadoes now since they're moving further and further east. So, yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions?
I know that one of the things that Helene did for North Carolina, they were not prepared for it to come into the mountains. If you have a weather event that is not like unexpected like that, I guess how often does that happen? And is that like something we need to be prepared for, or just keep in mind sometimes? Things that we just haven't experienced, or like the Haitian earthquake, it hadn't happened in 100 years when it popped back up.
So I think, thank you. Ming mentioned that, knowing what hazards, so even though it hasn't happened in 50 years, but knowing what hazards your community or the area that you live in is exposed to, whether or not you've experienced it in your lifetime, whether or not your mother, your grandmother, they've experienced it in their lifetime, but knowing I live in this area, we're susceptible to X, Y, and Z, and then how do I prepare for that? Because, so for example, what if a tornado should hit Baltimore City? Like most people perhaps wouldn't have seen a tornado, wouldn't have expected it, but it's something that the area could be susceptible to. So how do I prepare myself and my family for that? So a lot of the times we focus usually on the main thing, whether if you're on the West Coast, wildfires, earthquakes. If you're on the East Coast, it's usually hurricane, flooding, and like a snowstorm type of a thing. But there are other things that we need to worry about. And so ensuring that you know what your area is vulnerable or susceptible to, whether or not it's an event that has a frequent occurrence or something that's very rarely occurs, but ensuring that you're prepared for it anyway and staying informed.
I would also add with that is we have to keep climate change in mind. So, and that is, Helene going into the mountains historically was unheard of, but now it's not. I mean, and you think about St. Petersburg had record flooding during Milton, but they broke the record that was set during Helene. And so, within a week's time, St. Petersburg had record flooding twice. And climate change, what it's doing to our weather patterns are making them more intense and more frequent. So we're kind of flattening the curve of, of the extremes. We're making them more extreme, but also more frequent. So it's like within the context of climate change, I agree. I mean, everything you're saying, but I also, climate change is creating what was abnormal to the new normal. And we have to, engage and think about it within the context of climate change and weather patterns.
Yeah, that is so true. We've seen so many uncommon, unexpected disasters in different areas, like the Hawaiian Maui fire, right, and the Hurricane Helene. Those are good examples. But about disaster preparedness, there is something in common we can do. Like you need to have a plan. You need to stay informed. You need to have something. Essential supplies for a week, that kind of stuff. Those are common practices. Can help you.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say too, it's misinformation, right? So if you actually looked at the forecast for Helene, meteorologists had that forecasted over a week out. So you actually look like 10 days out. Their knowledge is getting so good in that forecasting. So it wasn't actually unexpected. It was unimaginable, but it wasn't unexpected, if that makes sense. But through, particularly through misinformation and lying and these campaigns of misinformation, I think that's another really dangerous part of it.
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah.
Information can so readily be disseminated. Is how do you ensure that the right one gets? I'm saying information can so readily be disseminated. We have access to all of these social media apps and so on. It's easy for any old bloke or girl to go online and say whatever.
Yeah.
How do the authorities ensure that the clear message, the factual information gets to people who need it at a time and in a timely manner? That is something I think that people still need to figure out, but work towards. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I wish we have a control of what the quality of the news that we have on social media, but unfortunately the only thing right now is to at least refer to the legit news channels, like if it's the BBC or something that are like credited, right? So those things, maybe if the news that's
Nowhere
being shared.
as well, and sure, but most people don't even know what.
Yeah, exactly. It's like whoever is speaking about their opinions and they're sharing their perspective, and they are sharing misinformation through this also on social media. I totally agree with you on that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any last questions? All right, you join me in thanking our panelists. So thank you.